Hi again. Today's book is Follow My Tracks by Kevin Thomas. Now, in the Rhodesian War, there were several prominent soldiers who had experience of hunting professionally, tracking, and language skills, for example. People like Andre Rabi, Del Watt, who both served with SAS, and the author of this book, Kevin Thomas, who worked for the Rhodesian game department and went into Selous Scouts. So those skills are obviously very much sought after when you're working in a bush war environment. The book goes into quite a bit of detail about the origins of the tracking teams in the Rhodesian forces, and a lot of credit is given to Alan Savory, who also worked for the Game and Wildlife Department. And he had the vision of starting units of military trackers who could follow the spoor of terrorists with a view to capturing or killing them. But he was also a pioneer and very much an instigator of the idea of pseudo-gangs. He had understood the campaign against the Mau Mau, which made use of such personnel. And he pushed for this very, very strongly. And his work led to eventually the formation of what was called the TCU, the Tracker Combat Units. And they were trained. Initially, the setup was run by the School of Infantry, but then it became a standalone unit down at Kariba. And then it was eventually absorbed by Selous Scouts, and it was run by their training troop under my old friend Dave Scott Donnellan. Kevin Thomas himself was involved in tracking operations, and he really was putting his previous professional training into use to do this. The techniques of tracking, how the trackers are used, the main tracker, the others casting on the flanks, and the protection element and so on, are very, very well explained in a book by Dave Scott Donnellan, Tactical Tracking Operations, and I'll put a link to it in the box below. They also did try the use of dogs. Dogs, obviously, with their fantastic sense of smell, are great at tracking. However, the rigours of the bush, particularly the heat of the Zambezi Valley, particularly in the summer, made it very, very hard on the dogs, and they didn't have the endurance of the human trackers, generally speaking. Kevin Thomas was a sergeant in the territorial force, and he was inclined to, he'd seen the SAS operating, and he was inclined to take SAS selection. And the personnel office, when they examined his skills from his employment as a professional hunter, he and his language skills, he was pushed in the direction of the nascent Selous Scouts who were just in the process of being formed, and he was in fact on the very first selection course. He admits that this first selection wasn't as task relevant as later selections. It was more on the SAS model, but nonetheless it was arduous and consisted to a large degree of load carries using heavy Bergens, and also they used terrorist backpacks of Chinese design, which were not as efficient, but were obviously what they would have to be using. And they would go for very long marches, trying to make a series of RVs, including climbing very, very high hill or mountain in the area, and all this against unknown time constraints. And a big factor was very limited food and water. And this was to accustom or to test the guys under the conditions, the operational conditions that they would be facing. And many of the biographies of Rhodesian and South African Special Force soldiers do mention the debilitating effect of thirst. Water was at a premium, particularly in the dry season, and the guys did suffer in the heat, under the stress of proximity of the enemy. The engine starts firing up with adrenaline and so on. That makes you thirsty, and it was a major concern. So selection did test this. The personnel on the selection courses and the personnel within Selous Scouts were a mixture of African soldiers, mainly from the Rhodesian African Rifles, an infantry regiment, and European soldiers who were initially mainly from the SAS and the RLI. And these had to be welded together in a functional unit, drawing on the best of both cultures. The Scouts had several sections. They had an assault troop, later assault group, which went into the neighbouring countries to carry out camp attacks on the terrorist bases by using mobile columns, disguised vehicles, disguised operators, to penetrate deeply, very deeply into those countries and take out the terrorists in what they thought was safety. The peak of that was the Nudzonia raid, where they killed 1,100 in one attack. There was also the reconnaissance troop, later reconnaissance group, which was mainly former SAS soldiers who generally didn't have to go through scout selection because they had been recruited for a very specific role, that deep penetration and reconnaissance. So they would go in to the neighbouring countries and carry out reconnaissance, generally for the assault group's camp attacks. And they would be inserted either by helicopter or by parachute, including free fall. And there was also the tracking element. As I mentioned, they ran tracking wing, and they also had this public face of tracking. Ron Reed Daly was very adept at using the media to project the image of the Scouts as being a tracking unit. And in the popular imagination, this is what they were. However, those other sections all conceal the true purpose of the Selous Scouts, which was the pseudo-gangs, the pseudo element. And this was completely secret. It was top secret even to other parts of the scouts, let alone to the rest of the army or, God forbid, to the public. And the training for the pseudo phase was very, very involved. So the soldiers had to all undergo a steep learning curve. Now, the African soldiers who were already infantry trained, they had to learn the specific skills for special forces soldiering, communication skills, calling in airstrikes, communicating with the fire force to talk them onto a target, and so on. Medical training to a high degree, this kind of thing. At the same time, the European soldiers had to learn a lot about African culture. They had to understand life in the bush, kraals, the villages, how the local population lived, how they their normal pattern of life. They had to understand this, what was the norm, before they could understand how it would be disrupted by the presence of terrorists, the signs and signals of that. So they had to be immersed in the culture. Then both races had to go through the training to be able to convincingly act as terrorists, not committing atrocities, but just knowing the mannerisms, the passwords, the Chimaringa songs, the taboos, and the little traps that were set when linking up with either a contact man who was the liaison between the local villagers and the incoming terrorists, or with the terrorists themselves. And this was a very involved and also rapidly changing system that varied depending on the location, whether you were near the Mozambique border or the Zambian border, whether you were operating against Zanla, Zipra, etc. So this was really a subject that the Selous scouts needed to absorb to a very, very, become expert to a very, very high degree. And this was done after selection on what was known as the dark phase. And a lot of information was provided by Special Branch, who briefed the guys on the interrogation of captures, that they would suck out as much information on current procedures as they could. So you probably understand straight away that most of the actual work in the pseudo-gangs would have to be done by the African soldiers. Even though the Europeans were disguised with black is beautiful cosmetic, the appropriate uniforms, beards to disguise their features, floppy hats and so on, there's no way that in a face-to-face meeting they could pass themselves off as African. So they would be up on the Gomo, on the hill, and they would be in an overwatch position and be communicating with UHF or VHF radios to higher headquarters, to the fire force, etc. And it was long and arduous work in the observation posts, and quite a few of the European scouts actually left the pseudo role because of this. They found it wasn't really to their liking. They went into something like the reconnaissance or the assault groups. But the backbone of pseudo operations and a big responsibility was on the African soldiers. And another point was the inclusion of the turned terrorists or tame terrorists, who had to be trusted to quite a high degree, and the lives of the whole call sign would be very much in their control in many situations. And generally speaking, it was a successful system. However, there were instances where the TTs went back to the terrorist side, they returned, or were double agents in the first place. And Kevin Thomas does describe a couple of these situations. They were rare, but they did happen. Likewise, the system of frozen areas for the pseudo-gangs to operate in where there were no other security forces to prevent blue-on-blue accidents happening. One of the things that the author was very annoyed at was a severe breach of OPSEC when his call sign was directed to a bush airstrip to be uplifted by Dakota, and when they emplaned, they were shocked to find that there was already a conventional army unit aboard, who were absolutely shocked at seeing these, what they thought were terrorists, getting on the aircraft, and it had to be explained to them that no, these are good guys, and that really blew the cover on pseudo operations in a big way. Finally, Kevin Thomas underplays the glamour aspect given to Selous Scouts in the media and in the minds of the general public. They sort of, the SAS, who were the other special forces, never really went out of the way to have much in the way of publicity. So it all fell on the Selous Scouts to give cover to the real operations, as I've explained. However, this did make them appear to be something of a super soldiers. And Kevin Thomas says this is really a biased view, and the SAS carried out amazing operations, and the RLI Fire Force were a superb striking arm, and they should be given appropriate credit. So it's a very interesting book, and it really adds to the literature on the Rhodesian Bush War. And as I said, it particularly shines a light on pseudo operations to a depth I don't think any other book has achieved. And it does really open the door on this little known aspect of current warfare.